I'd like to begin with a prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, amen. Heavenly Father, we thank you for your servants, C.S. Lewis, T.S. Eliot, Evelyn Waugh, and J.R.R. Tolkien. We pray that you will help us to understand their literature and their mindset so that we can penetrate more deeply into our Catholic faith. This we pray through Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay, well, this is the last session on C.S. Lewis, and next week Joseph will be here for 3 weeks on J.R.R. Tolkien, which should be a wonderful conclusion of this 12-week course. This evening, I'd like to talk about C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. I'll also be talking a little bit about C.S. Lewis's personal life. You might remember when we spoke about his personal life before, we spoke about his boyhood in Northern Ireland, how he went to private school, served in the First World War, was wounded, came home, did very well at Oxford, was then gotten a job began his academic career as a professor of poetry in Oxford, and continues on through the Second World War. In 1929, he's actually converted from his atheism back to a belief in God. In 1931, he actually accepts Christianity and begins to be practicing Christian, and to actually also begin writing his major books of Christian apologetics. Please come in. This is taking place pretty much during the 1930s and 40s, when he is also, he and the rest of England are involved in the Second World War. We now come to a time after the Second World War in his life, in the late 1940s and the 1950s. Now, in his personal life, remember when he came back from the First World War, he had taken up residence with Mrs. Moore, Janie Moore, the mother of his best friend who died in the First World War. And they'd promised to each other that if one of them died, the other would look after their family. And so he begins to take an interest and to live with Mrs. Moore and her daughter Maureen, the sister of Paddy Moore. And there's a question mark about the nature of their relationship. Remember, he first moves in with her when he's still an atheist and not a Christian. And so there's some question about whether that relationship was an immoral relationship or not. We don't know for sure. Some of the scholars of C.S. Lewis believe that he was actually in an intimate relationship with Mrs. Moore, and they were cohabiting. Others are not sure, and there's really uncertainty about that. Nevertheless, he has a commitment to Mrs. Moore, and we can assume that after he becomes a Christian in 1931, that relationship was actually a relationship of a son to a mother, and was not an intimate relationship. So after that, he's actually continues to live with Mrs. Moore and Maureen and take a brotherly and filial relationship to the family, helping to look after them. In 1951, this is 20 years after he becomes a Christian, Mrs. Moore passes away. So in 1951, he looks after her and has a caring relationship with her right up through 1951 when she actually passes away. It's interesting that in 1952, he actually meets another woman. So 1951, Mrs. Moore dies. In 1952, he meets an American writer named Joy Davidman. Joy Davidman had been an atheist and a communist, and she was converted to Christianity largely through the writings of C.S. Lewis. She was also from a Jewish background. So she's a convert from Judaism to Christianity, and in 1952, she had been corresponding with C.S. Lewis across the Atlantic. She's an American woman. In 1952, she travels to England to meet him. She meets him in Oxford, and they continue a correspondence and a friendship. C.S. Lewis finds her to be a very intellectual woman, a wonderful conversationalist, and as everyone said, she was quite a feisty Jewish-American woman. She spoke her mind bluntly, she spoke her mind very straightforwardly, and C.S. Lewis, as the blunt, straight-talking sort of man that he was, really appreciated that. Now, the story of their relationship is actually told in the film Shadowlands. Shadowlands was, the relationship was turned into a stage play and then into a film which starred Anthony Hopkins and Deborah Winger. It was the second film version. There was a BBC television version first. But there's a great scene when in the film where Joy Davidman is in Oxford and they're at this kind of drinks party with all these hoity-toity academic English people. And one of the professors sort of makes a condescending comment to her about being an American, and she comes back and she says, "Are you being smart or just rude?" And of course he's taken back by that, but C.S. Lewis's eyes light up because he didn't have any time for those hoity-toity snobs either. So they have a good friendship established, and then in 1953, she goes back to America, and her husband reveals that he's an alcoholic and a violent man. He reveals that he's having an illicit affair, and he wants a divorce. She has two sons, David and Douglas. David and Douglas Gresham, which is their father's name. And she comes with her two sons back to Oxford after this broken marriage. And she comes back to Oxford in 1953, and she establishes residence in Oxford. C.S. Lewis continues his friendship with her. And then in 1956, she moves to England permanently, and however, her tourist visa expires, and in 1956, C.S. Lewis marries her in a civil ceremony in order for her to be able to stay in England with her two sons. Because obviously, if she's married to an Englishman, she has the right to stay in England as his wife. However, they don't actually live together. They live separately, and he simply considers this to be a civil ceremony in the registry office, which is the English equivalent of going to the justice of the peace. So he's in this unusual relationship with her. In 1954, I think it was when they had their civil marriage. However, once they are together, and she's living in Oxford and they're seeing each other regularly, she comes down with cancer. She's only 45 years old. She's hit with cancer, and C.S. Lewis at that point realizes that he loves her and that if she should die, he would be devastated. And so he decides to marry Joy in a Christian ceremony. However, the Church of England at that point, it's very different now of course, but the Church of England at that point did not allow the remarriage of divorcees. So C.S. Lewis is in a conflict. He wants to marry this woman, but she's a divorced woman. And it goes against his faith and the faith of his church to actually marry Joy Davidman. He goes to see his bishop about it, and the bishop does not give permission and says, no, you can't marry her. He finds a priest, however, who will conduct the ceremony. So Joy Davidman, in the hospital, dying of cancer, marries C.S. Lewis against the advice of his church and against the discipline of his church. So he took a daring step to marry Joy Davidman. He obviously justified it in his own mind and justified it that her divorce was something which was imposed upon her. She didn't seek the divorce, and C.S. Lewis was certainly not a partner in the breakup of her marriage. So he justified that marriage for all these kind of reasons on his own. The marriage was the many people think was the final nail in the coffin with C.S. Lewis's friendship with J.R. Tolkien. Their friendship had been strained for the last 10 years or so through the 1950s, and then in 1956 when he married Joy Davidman, and Tolkien didn't like Joy. Most of C.S. Lewis's friends didn't like her. She was a brash, noisy, smart aleck American woman. But C.S. Lewis loved her. And J.R. Tolkien didn't appreciate her either. And so many people think that the marriage was the final end of their close friendship. They remained friends to the end of C.S. Lewis's life, but not close friends the way they were before. Because, of course, Tolkien, as a Catholic, had even stronger objections to the remarriage of a divorcee than even C.S. Lewis in the Anglican Church. The Anglican Church had that discipline still in place, but there are lots of people in the Anglican Church and in England at the time who were pushing the boundaries on that particular discipline. As Catholics who would disagree with remarriage after divorce, we would have to disapprove of C.S. Lewis's marriage to Joy Davidman. However, they prayed together that she would be healed, and in 1957, she actually had a remission from the cancer. And they were able to go to Greece on a vacation which she had always wanted to go to Greece. So C.S. Lewis took her to Greece on a vacation. She comes back in 1960. She comes back and the cancer returns, and she dies of the cancer in 1960. This is these are the circumstances of C.S. Lewis's book, which is called A Grief Observed. In A Grief Observed, he actually writes from a very personal experience of losing his wife and the grief that he went through in losing her. Remember that his mother died of cancer when he was a boy, okay? And so this echoes down into his loss of Joy so many years later. The details there of him losing his mother when he was a boy at the age of 9 to cancer, and then his loss of Joy later on, is played out very beautifully in the film Shadowlands and in the play Shadowlands, where the playwright actually takes the details from C.S. Lewis's life and weaves them together into a very moving scene where he grieves for Joy after her death and connects back with his boyhood loss. Because the way it's played out in the stage play and in the film, he has now made an attachment to his two stepsons, David and Douglas Gresham, who are Joy's sons by her husband in America. And of course, Douglas is about the same age when he loses his mother to cancer that C.S. Lewis was when he lost his mother to cancer. If you can get that film, it's really worth watching. It's not perfect, but it's a wonderful dramatic expression of what C.S. Lewis was going through during this time in his life. This is all happening during the 1950s, and this is also the time when he's writing and publishing the Chronicles of Narnia. The Chronicles of Narnia are C.S. Lewis's most popular books. There are 7 of them. There are over 120 million copies in print and translated into 47 different languages. Joseph and I wish for similar numbers. So what an amazing track record. And the other amazing thing about this is to realize C.S. Lewis's humility. When he died, when he was about to die in the early 1960s, he wrote to a friend saying that he hoped that this friend would help to look after Douglas and David Gresham, because by this time these boys were under his care as his stepsons. And also his brother Warren, his older brother, who suffered from alcoholism. And so C.S. Lewis was concerned about these 3 dependents that he had. And he wrote to a friend and saying, please help to look after them, because I'm sure all of my books will go out of print after I die. That's one thing he was not right about. 120 million copies in 47 languages. Of course, they've been made into television programs, they've been made into audio books, they've been made into movies. And so his fame has continued to skyrocket after his death in 1963. I'll just go through with you what happened to Lewis after Joy died in 1960. In 1954, he had transferred from Oxford to Cambridge. In 1953 or 1954, I'm not quite sure the date exactly, there was an election for the chair of the professor of poetry at Oxford. Now, the professor of poetry of Oxford was like this very prestigious position in Oxford University, which would eventually be given to one of the professors after a long career and a prestigious career. Most people thought C.S. Lewis was a shoo-in for the post. He had written some of the most influential academic books on the poetry of the Renaissance and the poetry of the Middle Ages. He was an amazing scholar who was internationally known for his scholarship in English poetry, but he was not elected as the professor of poetry in Oxford. And many people thought that the campaign against his election was motivated by other professors who were jealous of his secular popularity and also jealous and angry about his stance as a popular Christian apologist. Because by this time, his picture had been on the front of Time magazine. His apologetics books had published thousands and millions of copies around the world. And so he was a very popular author. And the other professors in Oxford were jealous of his popularity and also disapproving of his status as a very prominent Christian writer. So he did not get elected as the professor of poetry. But on the back of that, they offered him a post at Cambridge. And so he took up the post in Cambridge, and it was a little bit of, okay, you don't want me as professor of poetry? I'm out of here. So he went over to the competing University of Cambridge, where he was given a post as the professor of poetry in Cambridge. This meant, and he didn't drive, so this meant taking a train every Monday morning from Oxford to Cambridge. And if you've ever ridden on an English train, you know it's not a joyful experience, okay? It's long, it's grinding, it stops at every station. But he would go over every Monday morning from Oxford to Cambridge by train and then back again on Friday evening, spending the weekends at his house in Oxford. So he's doing this from 1954 onwards for about 5 or 6 years. And then in 1961, the year after Joy dies, he falls down with an attack of blood poisoning, and he's very ill and nearly dies. He resigns his post in Cambridge, and he's now living in his house in Oxford in 1962. In 1963, he falls ill again. In August of 1963, he has a stroke, and then in November 22nd, 1963, he dies of kidney failure in his house in Oxford. Who else died on November 22nd, 1963? JFK. Okay, and so the news of C.S. Lewis's passing was greatly overshadowed by that other death in Texas on that same afternoon. C.S. Lewis, therefore, is writing the Chronicles of Narnia in that decade before his death in the 1950s. And the Chronicles of Narnia are 7. The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Prince Caspian, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, The Silver Chair, The Horse and His Boy, The Magician's Nephew, and The Last Battle. And they're published in 1951, 52, 53, 54, 55, and 56. Published one after another, although they were not written one after the other. They were written together, and then they were published subsequently year by year. You might remember last time we spoke about C.S. Lewis's worldview and his philosophy, saying that he was a Platonist, basically believing in the reality of the spiritual world as opposed to the physical world, and therefore this philosophy of belief in the other world leads him also to write the Chronicles of Narnia, in which 4 English children, 2 brothers and 2 sisters, go through the wardrobe into another world. And this parallel world is called Narnia. Where did he get the name Narnia? Narnia is actually, there's a little village in Italy called Narni. And Lewis had seen a medieval map of Italy in which it was called Narnia. And he simply liked the name Narnia. In fact, some researchers have found out that there is actually a St. Lucy of Narnia. Did you know that? If you go to Italy, you find that every town, practically, and every village has its own saint. Okay, and so if you look it up, there is actually a St. Lucy of Narnia. And whether he got the name Lucy, which is one of the 4 Pevensey children or not, we don't know. But there is actually a St. Lucy of Narnia. And in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, the 4 Pevensey children are evacuated to an old country house in England. And this is set during the Second World War, when a lot of children were evacuated from London out to the country in order to save them in case of the Germans bombed London. And in fact, Lewis and his brother Warnie, living in the Kilns, which is their house in Oxford, actually had 3 evacuees stay with them before he wrote the Chronicles of Narnia. And so he sets the children being evacuated to a country house in Narnia, where they go through a wardrobe into this alternative world of Narnia. The 4 children are Peter and Edmund, Susan and Lucy. Lucy's the youngest, and she's the first to go through. And she comes back into the wardrobe, into the country house, to tell her brothers and sisters, and they don't believe her. And then they have another adventure in which all 4 of them go into Narnia. Edmund meets a character called the White Witch. And the White Witch is the queen of Narnia, and in Narnia it's always winter but never Christmas. And so they have their adventures in Narnia, and Edmund sells his soul to the White Witch. Do you remember what he was eager to have? Turkish Delight, which is a rather horrible kind of candy, which I tasted once I was in England. Anybody else ever tasted Turkish Delight? it's yucky, okay? It's like very sickly, sweet kind of jelly, okay, which smells of roses. Not nice. Anyway, Edmund liked it well enough to sell his soul for some. And as the story goes on, they have to try to get Edmund back from the White Witch, and they meet the character Aslan. And Aslan is a great lion who eventually makes a deal with the White Witch to ransom Edmund and save his life by giving his own life. And so Aslan is obviously a Christ figure who redeems Edmund and also banishes the White Witch and defeats the evil in Narnia. So there, I've told you the whole story in a nutshell. But if you read the story, you will see the various characters and see how they also portray the Christian story of redemption. And Lewis is criticized for this, but he said it wasn't intentional to start with. There's some nice quotes about his actual creative method. He was asked, where did it all come from? He said, "The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe all began with a picture of a fawn carrying an umbrella and parcels in a snowy wood. This picture had been in my mind since I was about 16 years old. And then one day when I was about 40, I said to myself, let's try to make a story out of it." So the whole thing began with this one image he had in his head. Where he got that image from, he didn't explain, but it was an image that came into his mind. He explains a little bit further about how it all came about. He says, "At first, I had very little idea about how the story would go, but then suddenly Aslan came bounding into it. I think I had been having a good many dreams of lions about that time. Apart from that, I don't know where the lion came from or why he came, but once he was there, he pulled the whole story together, and soon he pulled the 6 other Narnian stories in after him." So Lewis is describing what a lot of writers and imaginative writers would actually say is the way very often the creation of a story works. It begins with an idea, with a picture, with an image, and then you begin thinking about the image, and then it all begins to roll on from there. Obviously, his acceptance of the Christian faith and his dreams about a lion all come together, and the lion becomes the Lion of Judah, which is an image actually of the Messiah from the Old Testament. He is the Lamb of God, but he's also the Lion of Judah. And so Aslan becomes this great Christ figure in The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. The other stories, as they move on from there, Prince Caspian, the children return to Narnia, and however, the time passage in Narnia and the time passage in this world are different. So that when they return to Narnia, after becoming kings and queens in Narnia, they find that Narnian history has advanced hundreds of years forward. And now they meet Prince Caspian in the second book, and they have to go to war to reclaim Caspian's kingdom. He's actually the heir to the kingdom of Narnia. And so the children engage in a battle to regain Narnia for Prince Caspian. In the third book, The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, only Edmund and Lucy travel back to Narnia. And they find themselves swimming in the sea in Narnia, and they're there with another character called Eustace Clarence Scrubbs. And in one of Lewis's wittiest lines, the whole book begins with the line, "Once there was a boy named Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he almost deserved it." And Eustace is a bully and a brat, and he is redeemed in the story by meeting Aslan. In The Silver Chair, Eustace and Jill, another character from the school days, go back to Narnia, and they go down into the underworld of Narnia, and they also go on an adventure trying to reclaim the prince who's been taken captive this time by another wicked witch. The Horse and His Boy is the fifth of the Chronicles of Narnia, and in this one there are no children that go from this world into Narnia. Instead, it's a story of part of the history of Narnia. So it's set back before the Pevensey children got there and tells an adventure story of some characters who actually live in Narnia. In The Magician's Nephew, C.S. Lewis now is telling us about, he goes back even further in the history of Narnia and tells us how Narnia came to be created. And he makes some wonderful connections between this world and that world, and how the Narnia is created by Aslan at the very beginning. And then in the final book, published in 1956, The Last Battle, we get to move forward in Narnian history, and we see how the whole history of Narnia ends, and everything is tied up in the last battle between the Narnians and the Calormenes, who are the evil nation adjacent to Narnia. And Aslan comes in, and the whole thing winds up, and the children from Narnia return, and there's some beautiful, beautiful passages in the last battle about death and about dying and about the end of the world and what it will be like when we actually pass away. There's a scene, for instance, where the children don't die in Narnia, they die in this world, but they actually also realize that they're dead once they're in Narnia. And they go further up and further in, running up into the mountains of Narnia, where the reality becomes more and more and more real. Remember, in Lewis's cosmology, the other world is more real than this world, not less real. And so it is when they go to Narnia, Narnia is more real, just like that passage I read about in Great Divorce last week. Narnia is more real than this world. And as they penetrate further and further into Narnia and go further up and further in, it becomes more and more real. And the delights and the joys of heaven become more and more real the further up they go. In this way, we see actually the influence of Dante's Divine Comedy. Remember, Lewis is an expert in medieval poetry, and so he's an expert also in Dante. And in Dante as well, the further you go up the mountain of purgatory and the further you penetrate into heaven in the paradiso, the more real it becomes and the more wonderful it becomes. So let's think for a minute about some of the thought again in C.S. Lewis and what he's trying to do in the Chronicles of Narnia. First of all, one of the ways to get around Lewis's thinking is expressed in one of his essays, which is called Meditations in a Toolshed. And if you buy any books of C.S. Lewis's essays, this is the one, God in the Dock. It's the best collection of lots of his essays, and the essays are very accessible. They're very readable. Most of them are only 2 or 3 pages long, but in each one of them, his brilliant intellect and his brilliant imagination comes together to open up new ways of seeing and new ways of understanding the faith and new ways of understanding current issues. In England, if you are on trial, the defendant sits in a little sort of booth, which is called the dock, okay? And that's where a witness or a defendant would be cross-examined, okay? So God in the dock means God's in the dock and we're cross-examining him. Thus, the picture on the front of here of a lawyer who's leaning forward in debate against a defendant or a witness who's in the dock. So in his essay, Meditations in a Toolshed, C.S. Lewis says, I was in the darkened toolshed today, and there was a gap in the roof, and the sunlight was pouring through into the toolshed. And this shaft of light coming to the toolshed had motes of dust which were floating in it. And he says, I was entranced by looking at this shaft of light coming through the toolshed. He said, so I was looking at the shaft of light, but then I shifted my position and I looked along the shaft of light out through the gap, and I saw outside the trees, and further beyond that, the blue sky and the sun, which was beyond, which was outside. And so he says, we have to, if we want to see reality, we have to look at things, but we also need to look along things in order to see not only what they are, but what they mean. And Lewis is constantly trying to get us away from this modern, practical, scientific mindset where we look at something, but we don't look along it. We can see it for what it is, but we don't know what it means. And so one of the illustrations he gives, for instance, is love. What is love? Well, if you look at love, you might say, oh, that feeling of love that the young man is experiencing, that's just a combination of his erotic urges and his romantic notions and the beauty of the girl. That's all it is. It's just a collection of scientific, biological urges. But if you look along the love, you can see that his love actually has meaning and truth and beauty to it. And that truth and beauty is more difficult to pin down, but it's actually the meaning of the love. So he says in all things we should not only look at them, we should look along them. And so it is with his Chronicles of Narnia and his fantasy literature. He's trying to get us to look at reality, but also to look along reality and see it in a fresh way and to see it in a new way. And as Catholics, we should have the same attitude to the sacraments. When we come to the sacraments, we look at it and we say, here are the accidents of bread and wine. But if we can look along it in a moment of contemplation and adoration, we can see here actually is the body and blood of Christ. Okay? So his thinking on this is actually very Catholic, that we should be able to look at things, but also look beyond things and look along the beam of light, if you see what I mean, to see the deeper meaning. Along with this, and I recommend this book to understand the Chronicles of Narnia. It's by a friend of Joseph's and mine, Michael Ward, who's actually was also ordained as an Anglican priest in England and is now a Catholic priest. And Michael's written a big academic study which is called Planet Narnia. And this is his more accessible version of the book, which is a good read. And he has studied C.S. Lewis from boyhood and loved the Chronicles of Narnia from boyhood. He's now actually living and working in Oxford himself and is probably one of the most foremost C.S. Lewis scholars in the world today. And in his book, The Narnia Code, he talks about C.S. Lewis's, one of C.S. Lewis's essays about writing imaginative literature. And Lewis says, to make it realistic, a story has to be complete with the detail, enough detail to give the story a believable atmosphere, not just verisimilitude, which is giving enough details to make you think it's real, but he says you have to have enough to give it atmosphere. And the illustration he gives is in the story The Last of the Mohicans, when the hero is being threatened by an Indian, a warlike Indian, who's coming in to attack him. And the warlike Indian is creeping up on the hero with a tomahawk, with an axe. And Lewis says, it had to be an axe in order to give us the proper atmosphere. They had guns back then, but if the Indian had a gun, it wouldn't be nearly as threatening, and you wouldn't feel the atmosphere to the same extent. So Lewis is saying, to make an imaginative story believable, you need to have enough detail to actually help the reader to understand and feel the whole atmosphere. This is an example. Lewis imagines telling a Martian story, that is a story set on the planet Mars. How would you go about it? Well, he says, you would need Martianity throughout. You wouldn't just use Mars for a location and Martians for the characters. Martianity would have to be woven into the whole story, emotionally and atmospherically, as well as logically, so that the story would hang together and feel coherent and united. You couldn't just relocate a Wild West story or a New York crime story on another planet. You had to have a truly Martian atmosphere to make the whole thing emotionally and intellectually hold together. And when he says emotionally, he's aware that he wants to engage your emotions in the story in order to make it real for you, not just your mind. And if you read Out of the Silent Planet, which actually does take place on Mars, you'll see how C.S. Lewis does this, with lots of description, lots of imaginative description of the whole place, so that you really begin to see it in your mind's eye and feel the threat which Ransom, the hero, feels when he goes there, and to really experience the wonder and the awe and the beauty of Mars. So that's part of the emotion that you're feeling as you're reading the story. Now, based on these two ideas of Lewis's writing, looking along the beam of light rather than just at it, and also trying to develop the atmosphere of the story, Michael Ward tells the story of how he discovered a secret key to the understanding of the Chronicles of Narnia. And it came to him as he was reading one of C.S. Lewis's poems. And C.S. Lewis's poem was called The Planets. And in the poem, he goes through and he analyzes and talks about the character of the different planets. Remember last week we put up on the board the 7 different circles of the 7 planets that Lewis understood the medieval world, the way the medievals looked at the cosmos. And these 7 planets, Michael Ward theorizes actually give the atmosphere and the character to the 7 Chronicles of Narnia. And to remind you what C.S. Lewis, whether he believed this was true or whether he believed it poetically, we're not sure, okay? But his study of the Middle Ages would have understood that each of the 7 planets had what might be called a tutelary spirit, a spirit or a lord, an angelic lord over each one of the planets, which determined the character of the planets. And in the ancient world, the pagans understood these different spirits to be the different gods and goddesses, thus Venus and Mars and Jupiter and so forth, and named the planets after those spirits that they thought ruled those planets. Now, this has an interesting connection also with the New Testament and also with the Catholic understanding of the different ranks of angels. In the New Testament, in Ephesians, you might remember that verse where St. Paul says, "We do not fight against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers in the high places." The principalities and the powers would have been St. Paul's understanding of these spirits in the universe, these angel spirits in the universe, who actually controlled the different planets and saw them as spiritual power in the world and as being actually demonic powers in the world. So these different planets, these different powers are also spoken about in the 6th century writer Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite. So there's a mouthful for you, okay? He's called Pseudo-Dionysius because Dionysius is a character in the New Testament in, I think, St. Paul's encounter in Athens. Dionysius is a philosopher in the New Testament. The scholars call him Dionysius the Areopagite because he's from the Areopagus in Athens. He's called Pseudo-Dionysius of the Areopagite because he's actually writing in the 6th century. And scholars have determined that although he's writing with the name Dionysius the Areopagite, as if he's the 1st century philosopher, he's actually writing in the 6th century. And he's analyzing and categorizing the different strata of angels, 9 different levels of angels. And scholars believe Dionysius the Areopagite is actually drawing from much more ancient literature, going back into the Kabbalah of the Jewish religion and the Old Testament times, where these traditions about the 9 different levels of angels were actually part of the religious tradition. In the Christian tradition of angelology, these 9 categories are still considered to be the best we can do in trying to understand the different levels of angels and the different hierarchy of angels, but nobody pretends that it's actually church dogma, okay? This is speculative writing from the 6th century, so quite early, but not that early, okay? But drawing on much earlier traditions. And the 9 different levels are, the top level are seraphim, and then cherubim, and then the ophanim, which are also called the thrones, and then the middle triad of angels are the dominions, the virtues, and the powers, and then the bottom triad of angels are principalities, angels, and archangels. And the scholars of angelology believe that it's only the first 4 bottom levels of the angel hierarchy which have an activity in the cosmos. So they would be the angels and archangels, principalities and powers. And there's the reference back to Ephesians where St. Paul says, "We do not fight against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers." Remember, St. Paul's also influenced by Platonic philosophy, believing in the reality of the invisible realm as opposed to just the physical realm. So Lewis also, and this understanding of angelology and spirits carries right on through to the Middle Ages. And that's why Lewis sees that there are 7 different spirits or 7 different principalities and powers governing over these 7 planets. And Michael Ward picks up this belief of C.S. Lewis about the 7 different principalities and powers looking after the 7 principal planets, and actually sees a parallel in the Chronicles of Narnia. He's done an awful lot of research, and it's a very clever book. An awful lot of the Lewis scholars find it controversial and saying, I'm not too sure about this. I think you might be straining at things here, Professor Ward. And indeed, when you read about C.S. Lewis's own opinion, own reaction about how the story came about that I read to you, he says, all I had was an idea of a lion, and then it all sort of fell together. Michael Ward is saying, no, actually, I think Lewis planned the 7 Chronicles of Narnia around the 7 different planets. And the 7 different planets' characters give the atmosphere that is necessary for each one of the 7 Chronicles of Narnia. I don't have time to go into great detail about Michael Ward's theories, but very briefly, this is the pattern that he sees. And Michael Ward does actually admit that Lewis crafted the first Chronicles of Narnia just because he was having fun writing them. But Ward thinks that afterwards, in writing the last 4 or 5 of the Chronicles of Narnia, that actually Lewis saw this pattern developing and actually began to do it consciously. So the first Chronicle of Narnia is the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and Michael Ward connects this with the planet Jupiter, also known as Jove. Okay. Now the character of Jove in pagan literature is, well, jovial. Okay, and that's where the word comes from. Jove is a life-loving, jolly, joyful, jovial character. What is the order of the Chronicles of Narnia? Should you read them in the chronological order of the times, the chronology of Narnia? If you do, you would read The Magician's Nephew, which is about the creation of Narnia. Then you would read The Horse and His Boy, which is a historical story from Narnia. And then you would read The Lion, the Witch, and Wardrobe, Prince Caspian, Voyage of the Dawn Treader, The Silver Chair, and at the end, The Last Battle. However, other scholars and Lewis commentators say, no, you should read it in the order they were written, because that's how Lewis conceived them.
Is that what Ward does?
Ward takes them in the order that they're written. And he does so for a clear purpose, okay? He compares Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe to Jupiter, or Jove, because the mood of the story is jovial, okay? Aslan is this great, wonderful, all-embracing, jovial lion, okay? When he's serious, he gives his life for Edmund, but Aslan is basically this jovial, embracing, life-affirming, joyful character. Ward also uses this to explain the strange fact that Father Christmas, or Santa Claus, comes into the story. The critics of Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe say, if Narnia isn't a Christian place and they've never heard of Jesus, why does Father Christmas or Santa Claus come into the story? That's dumb. Was Lewis just throwing it in there because he wanted to have Father Christmas and he knew children would like Father Christmas? No. Michael Ward says Father Christmas is there because Father Christmas, Santa Claus, is also a big, fat, jovial character. Okay? He's a Jove-like figure. And therefore C.S. Lewis keeps him in there because after it was published, some of C.S. Lewis's friends said, take Father Christmas out of there. That's dumb. Okay? You don't need him. And Lewis kept him on purpose, and Michael Ward says, this is because, according to Michael Ward's theory, Jupiter, Jove, a jovial story, is the atmosphere and the mood of The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe. Okay? He then goes on and notices that in Prince Caspian, the theme of the story and the plot of the story is military. There's a war going on. Prince Caspian is a soldier. Edmund and Lucy and Susan and Peter come back as warriors. They're coming in as princely warriors to engage in the battle that Prince Caspian has to go on. And there's lots of warfare and fighting. And so Michael Ward says, which of the 7 planets is the god of war? Mars. Okay? And so Mars is the planet which is linked with Prince Caspian. In the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, Dawn, there's lots of gold. Do you remember in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, Eustace actually finds a dragon's treasure trove of gold? there's gold cropping up in the story all the time. And the sun is always shining in as golden. They're seeking after gold. There's greed for gold. There's that one scene in the story, remember, where they actually go to the lost island, and there's a pool where if you touch the water, whatever touches the water turns to gold. Okay, and in the story of Out of the Silent Planet, when Ransom goes to Mars, there's actually a creature on Mars who are like miners, and they mine gold, which they call the sun's blood. Okay, and so which of the planets, therefore, is linked with the voyage of the Dawn Treader? The sun. Okay, the voyage of the Dawn Treader. They're actually going towards the setting sun at the very end. So Michael Ward pulls out all these references to gold and to the sun in Voyage of the Dawn Treader, saying that the Voyage of the Dawn Treader is matched up with the planet of the sun. Remember, the sun is regarded as a planet. The Silver Chair takes place, a lot of it takes place at night and underground, and the underground world in the Silver Chair is a reflection of the ground up above. So which planet is associated with silver? By the light of the silvery moon, okay? And so the Silver Chair and the word silver is actually a link, therefore, that Lewis, according to Ward's theory, is linking the Silver Chair with the moon. The horse and his boy, this gets a bit strained, I think, in Ward's theory, but Mercury is also called Quicksilver, and also is linked in with twins, and with the twins of in the star system, the twins of Gemini. And so Mercury is linked with the horse and his boy, because in the horse and his boy there are a couple of sets of twins, okay? And interestingly, and I think this is where Ward's theory is pretty strong, the twins, one of the twins is a boxer and the other twin is an archer. And actually, the twins of Castor and Pollux in the twins of Gemini, the stars, one is an archer and one's a boxer. So it seems by this time that Lewis is probably doing this consciously. In The Magician's Nephew, the hero has to go and find a magic apple in Narnia to take back to give to his mother, who is dying of cancer. Okay, so there's Lewis's own story echoing into The Magician's Nephew. And in The Magician's Nephew, we're taken into a world full of parks and gardens and orchards and an abundance of life. And also the key characters in there are female and searching for the female. And so which planet is associated with the female, with fecundity, with fertility, with the apple, like the second Eve, and so forth? And this is the planet Venus, okay? So The Magician's Nephew has a parallel, according to Michael Ward's theory, with Venus. And then The Last Battle is associated with the planet Saturn. We use the word Saturnine. What does Saturnine mean? If you say that a person has a Saturnine personality, they're gloomy. They're an Eeyore, okay? They're a pessimist. It's doom and gloom and darkness. Also, Saturn was associated with Father Time and the passage of time and the end of time. What is The Last Battle about? It's about the end of time in Narnia. And Father Time, with his scythe, actually makes an appearance in The Last Battle, kind of the way Father Christmas makes an appearance in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So, Ward's theory that The Last Battle is linked with Saturn, therefore, is a pretty good guess. And like I say, scholars are divided about Ward's theory, about whether it was intentional on Lewis's part, but I'm convinced he's made a pretty good case, and I recommend it. It's a good read, it's very accessible, and if you want to learn more about this theme and the underlying mood of each of the Chronicles of Narnia, then Michael Ward's your man. He really pins it down. And thinking what Lewis said about atmosphere in a story helps us to understand the atmosphere, therefore, that he wants us to feel in each one of the Chronicles of Narnia. So to recap a little bit, Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, we should feel a sense of joviality and a sense of joy and a sense of abundance that we have with the character of Jove. In Prince Caspian, we should feel ready to fight the battle and fight the good fight because it's about the military and fighting the war. In the Voyage of the Dawn Treader, we're sharing in the joy and the delight of gold and warmth and the sun and all of the life-giving attributes that comes with that. In the Silver Chair, it's more introspective and the mood is more, it's darker and it's more reflective because we're talking about the moon and we're talking about the night. And the queen, the wicked queen in the Silver Chair is very much a creature of night. There's lots of lanterns, there's lots of creeping through caves, there's lots of darkness in the Silver Chair. In The Horse and His Boy, we're meant to get the mood of Quicksilver, temperamental, moving quickly, and The Horse and His Boy is a story where there's lots of action. They're all on horseback, they're galloping across the land, there's lots of movement, there's lots of instability going on. And in Magician's Nephew, we're caught up with the mood of the boys searching for their mother and saving their mother who's dying and going to get an apple to save her, a magic apple. And we're caught up in that sense of the fertility and the fecundity of the woman and the woman who helps to save the world and bring life. And then at the last battle, we're caught up in the mood of a kind of apocalyptic mood, the end of the world, the end of, there's a kind of antichrist who comes into the story, and we see the end of all things, which is a kind of a gloomy and a serious, dark kind of aspect in the last battle. So, I will encourage you, therefore, to not listen to anybody else talking about C.S. Lewis, but look along C.S. Lewis, okay, and read C.S. Lewis. The Chronicles of Narnia are fun and exciting to read. If you have children or grandchildren, read them aloud, okay, and the children will love you for it. If you want to have some easy, pleasurable, stimulating reading, read his essays. I also recommend, like I did last week, the Great Divorce, which is my favorite of his books, but also any of his apologetic writings as well to help you to get a clearer understanding of your faith and to do so with a clear understanding that he's writing as a non-Catholic, but from a very Catholic understanding, a very Catholic viewpoint. Next week, Joseph is going to begin his 3 weeks on J.R.R. Tolkien, and Joseph is a real expert on Tolkien, so you're going to enjoy staying with us for the next 3 weeks. He asks you to read Tree and Leaf, which I believe is a book or an essay by Tolkien about his theory of mythology, which he's going to be talking about next week. You should be able to find Tree and Leaf online without having to buy a copy. I'm not sure, I didn't look it up, but I think it's available online. So Tree and Leaf by J.R.R. Tolkien for next week. I believe, I'm no expert in angelology, but the question is, are the principalities good angels or evil angels? I think the angelologists would say that these 9 categories of angels could be good or bad, okay? And that the bad ones have fallen from their place into this realm. And thus St. Paul's saying we struggle against principalities and powers, that there are bad principalities and powers out there, but there are also good ones. Do I have a favorite Chronicle of Narnia? Well, everybody loves Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe because that's the first one, and that's the one that takes you into Narnia. But I think my favorite is the Silver Chair. And the Silver Chair has a wonderful character in there called Puddleglum. Okay, and Puddleglum is a gloomy, pessimistic kind of character who's always very careful and very cautious. And but there's a great scene in there when the Wicked Witch is saying they're underground, they're in a cave, and she's saying to the characters, that place you call Narnia, it doesn't exist. That's just in your imagination. This is the real world. And there you see, again, I spoke about the Plato's cave, the 2 worlds. She's saying, that thing you call the sun, that's just a lantern like this one hanging in the cave. There's no such thing as the sun. And she tries to convince them that there is no Narnia, and they've just dreamt the whole thing. In Aslan, there's no such thing as Aslan. That's just in your imagination. And Puddleglum, and she starts a fire in which she throws on some magic dust, which puts up some smoke which begins to intoxicate them. And Puddleglum listens to all this, and in a wonderful piece, I almost have the line memorized. He stamps out the fire and he says, "You'll be excusing me, madam," he says, "but this world that you say is real isn't very nice." It's much more eloquent than I can put it. He says, "And I'm thinking that the world you say is a make-believe is actually a darn sight better than the one that you think is real. And that's been the work of just these children here, if it's make-believe. So if you don't mind," he says, "I'll keep the make-believe world and you can have what you call the real world." Anyway, Lewis writes it really well. And that makes Silverchair my favorite. It does, okay. If you're unfamiliar with it, the Kabbalah, which is spelled various ways, Kabbalah, or with a C sometimes. The Kabbalah is basically ancient Jewish esoteric knowledge. Okay. Remember, in addition to the Old Testament, there's lots of other Jewish writings about the law, about the regulations, but also about spirituality and about angels and about the patriarchs and about extra legends and myths associated with the Jewish tradition. Basically, and of course the early Christian writers, including Saint Pseudo-Dionysius and the others, were aware of these writings and drew on these writings and gave them a Christian interpretation. When it comes to actually Catholic beliefs, our roots are in all of that, but it's not dogma, it's not Catholic doctrine, and we should not actually spend a lot of time in it. We have enough time and effort to explore the Catholic treasures of the Church without having to dig into the Kabbalah. And Kabbalah was influential in the Middle Ages also with the alchemists. The alchemists in the Middle Ages were various, sometimes heretics, sometimes occultists, who were exploring occult powers, and that helped. They were delving into the Kabbalah as well with that. And Lewis would have been familiar with a lot of their writings, okay, because there were lots and lots of books and theories and so forth for the alchemists and the occultists. And Lewis would have been familiar with their writings, although he was not digging into it in order to do occult work. So, I mean, if you're interested in it, you can read these things, but remember, it's a mixture of ancient Jewish witchcraft, demonology, angelology, creepy stuff, spooky stuff, and sometimes just stupid, superstitious stuff. Well, in a way, The Magician's Nephew is a prequel, in as much as it takes place in the chronology of Narnia. It's the first one because it talks about the creation of Narnia. Okay, so The Magician's Nephew is a kind of prequel to The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But so in that respect it is, but there isn't a prequel to the whole Narnia series. Again, there's controversy about it, okay? We have his letters to a lot of people. His letters have all been edited, and one of the readers, a boy, wrote to C.S. Lewis and said, "What order should I read them in?" And he says, I think they should be read with The Magician's Nephew first, because that's the chronological order, because that's when Narnia was created, and then The Horse and His Boy, and then the others. He says, but my mom says I should read them in the order that they were written. And C.S. Lewis writes back and says, no, he writes back and says, actually, your mom has a point, but you go ahead and read them with Magician's Nephew first. I think that's a good idea. So some scholars have said, so C.S. Lewis says, read them with Magician's Nephew first, and Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe third. And then other scholars come back and say, yeah, but he was just being nice to that kid. So, scholars, take your pick. Yeah, I'm in favor of reading them in the order they were published, because when you get to The Magician's Nephew, you say, wow, now I know how Narnia was created. This is really cool. Okay, and that's where the lamppost came from. Okay, it depends which publisher. Okay, I've read up on this a little bit, and the first publishers published them, of course, in the order with Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe first, all the way through. But then various different publishing houses published different editions of the Chronicles of Narnia. And so there was a time when the publishers were actually putting Magician's Nephew first, to read first all the way through. And then another publisher came along and said, no, we're going to go with the original set, the original order. So it depends which edition you have. Okay? No. In fact, this brings us to an interesting point about Tolkien and Lewis. Tolkien did not like Narnia at all, okay, for lots of complicated reasons. Ask Joseph about it next week, okay? But also, Narnia was very popular almost instantaneously, okay? And Lord of the Rings had a slow takeoff, okay? So Lord of the Rings only started becoming really popular in the 1970s, okay? And if you remember the 1970s, as I do, it was really popular in the college scene, okay? And there was graffiti all around American college campuses saying Frodo lives and things like that, you know. So it became popular in the 1970s amongst the college set. And that's when Tolkien's fame really began to take off as well. And Tolkien survived, I think, to 1971, 1972, something like that. So he did see the success of Lord of the Rings, but not the monumental success that it has now. Okay, thank you all so much. Don't forget about Rosary College and the support that it needs. Talk it up if you can. Tell people there's a new Catholic college starting in Greenville. Michael and Michelle are the people to talk to about that further. And we hope that in a couple of years it's going to really take off.